both attorney and me, we were talking to ICE people, explaining them her status, that it is a perfect status, that she has TPS, she filed for extension, waiting for the extension. I repeated it a couple of times, but they were saying she like her status is expired, so they will detain her.
NBC7 reached out to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for comment on this case, and we're awaiting a response. Right now, Victoria's at the Otay Mesa Immigration Detention Center. But Victor says she spent the last 3 days with little to no sleep.
She said very harsh and inhumane attitude, and you basically you don't have anything, you don't have phone, you don't have spare clothes. She basically didn't sleep for 3 days.
You did not witness what you just saw. You witnessed something much more horrifying than any simple bureaucratic error could ever explain. And I need you to understand the monstrous architecture of state violence that just unfolded in that USCIS building in downtown San Diego, because Victoria Bulavina had just finished the final interview in her green card application when the officer said she needed to step out, then returned with 2 federal agents who said they were taking Bulavina to detention, handcuffed her and led her away. And here's the part that should make your blood boil, with such intensity that you can barely contain the righteous fury coursing through your veins, because this is where the entire edifice of American exceptionalism crumbles into dust. This is where the myth of due process reveals itself as nothing more than a cruel joke told by the powerful to the powerless. Bulavina's legal status to be in the U.S. has never expired at any point, meaning federal agents would have had no possible charge to even seek her detention. Let that sink in for a moment while I tell you what's really happening here, because this story about Victoria, this Ukrainian woman who fled a literal war zone created by Putin's imperial aggression, who came to this country seeking refuge and found love with Victor Korol, an engineer diagnosed with lymph node cancer who had to undergo chemotherapy, who married him in November 2024, and was literally at the finish line of her legal immigration journey. This story is not an aberration or a mistake, or an unfortunate bureaucratic mix-up that will be corrected once someone higher up the chain realizes what happened. This is the system working exactly as designed, and here's where it gets even more chilling, because we need to talk about what's happening to Ukrainians across this country right now in December 2025, and I'm going to lay out a pattern of cruelty so systematic and deliberate that it reveals the true nature of American immigration enforcement as nothing more than racialized state terror, dressed up in the language of law and order. The U.S. deported 50 people to Ukraine this week, in what appears to be the single largest such deportation from the U.S. since the country has been at war with Russia. Since Russia's invasion in 2022, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has deported 105 Ukrainians in total, with 13 in the last quarter of 2024. And these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are human beings being sent back into an active war zone where they will be conscripted into the army and likely killed, according to attorneys fighting these cases, and the sheer audacity of this brutality is staggering when you consider that just 3 years ago the Biden administration was promising to welcome 100,000 Ukrainians fleeing Russian aggression through programs like Uniting for Ukraine. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and I need you to stay with me here, as we descend into the grotesque heart of this machinery of suffering, because what happened to Victoria isn't just about one woman at one interview, it's about 607,000 Venezuelans, 232,000 Salvadorans, 103,700 Ukrainians, and 1,900 Sudanese nationals who were granted temporary protected status under Biden and are now watching those protections evaporate under Trump's second administration, and the Trump administration has taken aim at what had been a significant development during the Biden tenure, a population of as many as 4 million unauthorized immigrants who were able to enter or remain lawfully with protections including humanitarian parole and temporary protected status, and has swiftly and systematically dismantled many of those programs and revoked many of these statuses. This is ethnic cleansing by administrative fiat. This is the deliberate destruction of legal pathways that allowed vulnerable people to escape war and persecution, and the fact that courts have temporarily blocked some of these terminations doesn't change the fundamental reality that millions of people are living in a state of perpetual terror, never knowing if tomorrow will be the day ICE shows up to rip them away from their families and send them back to countries where death awaits them. And here's where the moral bankruptcy of the entire system becomes impossible to ignore, because let me tell you what's actually happening inside these detention facilities right now in December 2025, while Victoria sits in Otay Mesa, And you need to hear this because there have been persistent, troubling reports of poor conditions in detention facilities across the country, including detainees being given spoiled food and non-potable water, facing severe overcrowding, lack of access to showers and clean clothes, and having harsh lights on 24 hours a day, and at least 23 people died in ICE detention in FY 2025, compared to 24 who died over the prior 4 years combined, which represents a catastrophic spike in mortality that should be triggering congressional investigations and international human rights interventions, but instead gets buried on page 17 of newspapers that are too busy both sides the issue to actually report on the systematic torture happening in facilities that hold over 2,700 people, making them the country's largest immigration detention center, at places like Fort Bliss, where a leaked internal ICE inspection found the facility violated over 60 federal detention standards in the first 50 days of its opening. Let's talk about Fort Bliss for a moment, because this is where the Trump administration's immigration policy reveals itself as nothing less than a crimes against humanity prosecution waiting to happen. This facility hastily opened in August 2025 on the military base formerly used to intern people of Japanese descent during World War II, which is such a perfect metaphor for American racism that if you put it in a novel, people would say you were being too on the nose, and at Fort Bliss advocates summarized accounts of horrific conditions, including beatings and sexual abuse by officers against detained immigrants, beatings and coercive threats to compel deportation to third countries, medical neglect, hunger and insufficient food, and denial of meaningful access to counsel. Conselli, and here's the part that should make you want to scream until your voice gives out. People detained attested that officers have beaten detained people and used the threat of violence, criminal charges, and imprisonment in attempts to coerce non-Mexican immigrants to cross the border into the Mexican desert. This is torture, full stop. This is the United States government engaging in systematic physical abuse to force people into accepting deportation to countries where they have never lived. And the fact that this is happening on American soil in 2025 should shatter any remaining illusions about this country's commitment to human rights or the rule of law. But the cruelty doesn't stop there, because I need to tell you about what's happening to children right now, and if you're not already enraged, then this should push you over the edge, because ICE sent 600 immigrant kids to detention in federal shelters this year, setting a new record, and White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson defended this by claiming the Trump administration is ensuring that unaccompanied minors do not fall victim to dangerous conditions, which is Orwellian doublespeak of such breathtaking cynicism that it would be darkly funny if it weren't destroying the lives of children who are being ripped away from families they've lived with for years after traffic stops for cracked windshields. Think about that for a second. Think about the kind of society we've become when a 15-year-old boy named Carlos, who came to the U.S. from Guatemala at 13 and was placed with his aunt, can be detained during a traffic stop and sent to a for-profit detention facility operated by Geo Group, one of the largest private prison corporations in America that profits directly from human suffering, and when immigration officers paid an unannounced visit to his family's home and came onto the property without permission, asking if any immigrants were living there, which is the kind of Gestapo tactics that should make every single person in this country deeply uncomfortable, regardless of their views on immigration policy. Now let me connect the dots here, because what's happening to Victoria and Carlos and the 50 Ukrainians just deported into a war zone isn't happening in a vacuum. This is part of a deliberate strategy of maximum cruelty designed to terrorize immigrant communities into self-deportation, and the numbers tell a story of unprecedented expansion of the carceral state, because as of September 2025, the Trump administration has nearly 60,000 immigrants held in ICE detention facilities, a 50% increase from 39,000 held at the end of the Biden administration in December 2024. ICE detention spending increased more than 400% from approximately $3 billion in FY 2024 to over $14 billion in FY 2025, which means billions of taxpayer dollars are being funneled into private prison corporations to operate facilities where people die at record rates while being denied basic human dignity. Close to 86% of immigrant detainees are held in privately run facilities, which means the suffering of human beings is literally a profit center for corporations that donate heavily to Republican campaigns, and this is the most nakedly corrupt marriage of state power and private capital since the convict leasing system of the Jim Crow South. And here's where we need to talk about the breathtaking hypocrisy at the heart of all of this, because remember that the United States spent the last 3 years positioning itself as the champion of Ukrainian sovereignty and democracy against Russian imperialism. We sent billions of dollars in military aid. We imposed devastating economic sanctions on Russia. We rallied NATO allies to support Ukraine's fight for survival. And yet at the exact same moment we were making these grand pronouncements about standing with Ukraine against authoritarian aggression, the Trump administration is taking steps to reverse immigration protections for approximately 240,000 Ukrainians who sought refuge in the U.S. following Russia's invasion, and these are people who came here legally through programs the Biden administration specifically created to fulfill America's humanitarian obligations. Programs like Uniting for Ukraine, which allowed an unlimited number of Ukrainians sponsored by Americans to come to the U.S. and work here legally without having to go through the lengthy visa process. The message could not be clearer. Ukrainian lives matter when they're useful props for geopolitical messaging against Russia. But the moment those same Ukrainians show up on American soil seeking the refuge we promised them, they become disposable bodies to be fed into the deportation machine. Let's dig deeper into the TPS situation, because this is where the administrative violence becomes almost incomprehensible in its scope, and attorney Caroline Matthews said Bulavina's legal status never expired at any point, and asked a person who has done everything right, is right now, as we speak, unfindable. How is that the aspirational goal of this nation? That word unfindable should haunt you, because that's what happens in authoritarian states. That's what happens when the government disappears people, and the fact that it's happening to someone whose paperwork was in perfect order, someone who was literally at her green card interview, someone who had done absolutely everything the system required of her, reveals that this isn't about law enforcement or border security or any of the sanitized language ICE uses to justify its existence. This is about power and control, and sending a message that no immigrant is safe, no matter how perfect their papers are, no matter how much they've contributed to American society, no matter how many lawyers they have, or how many times they explain that their TPS renewal is pending. And speaking of TPS, let me tell you about the legal gymnastics the Trump administration is performing to strip protections from people who have every legal right to be here, because immigration judges are denying bond requests because of new ICE legal arguments that say people are not eligible for bond. Arguments that even immigrants who have spent years inside the country are legally still trying to enter the U.S. because they were never given permission to enter in the first place, which is such a Kafkaesque interpretation of immigration law that it would be absurd if it weren't ruining lives. Think about what this means. You could live in the United States for a decade, build a life, start a business, marry an American citizen, have children who are U.S. citizens, and the government can still claim you're an applicant for admission, who has no right to a bond hearing, and can be detained indefinitely. A federal district court has given back the right of many immigrants to ask for release from immigration detention on bond by overruling a Board of Immigration Appeals case, but the fact that this legal battle had to be fought at all demonstrates how completely ICE has abandoned any pretense of due process or basic fairness. Now I want you to think about Victor Corral for a moment, this cancer survivor who just went through chemotherapy, who found love with Victoria on Tinder, who was building a life with her in San Diego, and who now has no idea where his wife is or when he'll see her again because she's being held in detention as if she is a prisoner, even though she committed no crime and violated no law. The psychological torture of this situation is impossible to overstate. The way it destroys not just the person detained, but everyone who loves them. The way it sends shockwaves of fear through entire communities who now understand that doing everything right, following every rule, submitting every form on time, none of it matters when ICE decides you're a target. And Victoria isn't alone in this nightmare. Because of mid-November, more than 65,100 people were in ICE detention nationwide, with Texas facilities holding over 25% of them, and most of these people have no criminal conviction, and many of those who did were for minor crimes such as traffic violation, which completely destroys the narrative that ICE is focused on dangerous criminals, when in reality they're grabbing anyone they can to meet Trump's deportation quotas. Let me be absolutely clear about what's driving this, because it's not about public safety or national security or any of the justifications you'll hear from DHS spokespeople. This is about racism and xenophobia weaponized through state power. This is about Trump's campaign promise of mass deportations being implemented through a vast expansion of the detention and deportation apparatus, regardless of the human cost. The Trump administration has taken 181 immigration-specific executive actions through April 29, exceeding the 94 actions of the Biden administration's first 100 days and representing a six-fold increase over the fewer than 30 actions during the same period in Trump's first term, and these actions have instilled fear in immigrant communities, with schools reporting reduced attendance, which means children are literally missing school because their parents are too terrified to let them leave the house. This is what state terror looks like in a democracy. This is how authoritarian impulses manifest when constrained by the remnants of constitutional governance, through administrative actions and prosecutorial discretion, and the selective enforcement of laws that allow ICE to turn human beings into statistics while claiming they're just following orders. And here's the part that should radicalize every single person who claims to care about human rights, because the conditions Victoria is experiencing right now in Otay Mesa Detention Center are the same conditions that advocates have been documenting for years, including constant illumination, lack of privacy with cameras above toilets, exposure to insects, and serious sanitation failures including overflowing toilets with fecal matter seeping into where people are sleeping. And this is at facilities that are supposedly meeting federal detention standards according to DHS officials, who are either lying or operating under standards so low they permit what Amnesty International describes as a deliberate system built to punish, dehumanize, and hide the suffering of people in detention. The Amnesty report on Florida facilities documents conditions that in some cases amount to torture. And when international human rights organizations are using the word torture to describe what's happening inside American detention facilities, that should trigger a national crisis of conscience, that should bring people into the streets demanding immediate closure of these facilities and prosecution of everyone involved in maintaining them. But instead what we get is silence from too many quarters, an equivocation from politicians who should know better, and mainstream media coverage that treats this as just another immigration policy debate, rather than the humanitarian catastrophe it actually is. The Biden administration deserves particular condemnation here, because they had 4 years to dismantle this infrastructure of cruelty, and instead they maintained it. They deported hundreds of thousands of people. They kept ICE funded and operational. They made only cosmetic changes to enforcement priorities, while leaving the fundamental machinery of detention and deportation intact and ready for Trump to use with maximum efficiency. The administration focused enforcement priorities on individuals posing threats to national security and public safety or recent border crossers, while redirecting resources from ICE to help manage pressure of increased migrant arrivals at the southwest border. But this supposed restraint meant nothing when Trump returned to power because all the infrastructure was still there, all the detention beds, all the private contracts with Geo Group and CoreCivic, all the legal precedents allowing indefinite detention and the denial of bond hearings, and now we're seeing the predictable result of that failure to fundamentally transform the immigration system because we are witnessing an unprecedented expansion of the immigration detention system, with billions of taxpayer dollars being funneled into the hands of private prison corporations who are building and operating abusive detention facilities, while deaths in custody and other egregious abuses reach record levels. Representative Pramila Jayapal gets it exactly right when she says, under the Trump administration, we have seen a shocking surge in the detention of people who have committed no crimes, being locked up in increasingly horrifying conditions. People are being held in squalor, largely in private for-profit detention facilities, all to pad the bottom lines of prison corporations that donate to Donald Trump and Republicans. And this is the kind of systemic corruption that in a functional democracy would lead to mass resignations and special prosecutors and congressional investigations that actually have teeth instead of the performative oversight we get from Democrats, who seem more interested in appearing reasonable than in actually stopping the violence. Think about what it means that Victoria is detained right now, with no phone, unable to contact her husband, and according to what detainees typically experience, probably doesn't have spare clothes, is dealing with sleep deprivation, and is being subjected to punitive measures designed to break her will. This is psychological warfare waged by the state against vulnerable people, and the stated reason for her detention, that her status had expired, according to ICE even though her attorney and husband repeatedly explained her TPS renewal was pending, is a lie so transparent it barely qualifies as a pretext. The truth is that ICE can detain anyone at any time for any reason or no reason at all, because they operate with near total impunity, because the government has provided little transparency or oversight into detention centers, and several congressional Democrats have sued the government after being denied entry, sometimes by force into facilities to conduct oversight. When elected representatives cannot enter facilities to check on conditions, when the press is denied access, when advocacy organizations have to piece together information from traumatized detainees and leaked internal documents, you're not living in a democracy anymore. You're living in a police state that maintains a democratic facade while operating concentration camps at the margins. I use that term concentration camps deliberately because that's what these facilities are. They are places where people are concentrated based on their identity, held in conditions that violate basic human dignity, and subjected to treatment that causes serious mental and physical harm. The fact that people eventually get deported rather than exterminated doesn't change the fundamental nature of what's happening, especially when deportation itself can be a death sentence as it is for people like Roman Surovtsev, who fear their lives will be taken in a war they know nothing about, leaving their U.S. citizen spouses widows and their children without fathers. Surovtsev's case is particularly illuminating because he was born in the USSR city that is now Mariupol, and fled at 4 years old after his father, a Chernobyl nuclear power plant worker, died from radiation poisoning, and after living in the United States for decades, checking in with ICE regularly, building a family and a business, he was suddenly detained and faces deportation to a country that won't even confirm he's a citizen and can't provide travel documents in a language he speaks. This is the banality of evil in action. This is how atrocities happen in modern bureaucratic states, not through dramatic pronouncements of genocidal intent, but through the routine application of administrative procedures that treat human beings as case numbers to be processed and removed. And the legal framework enabling all of this is so fundamentally broken that even when advocates win court victories, they're often Pyrrhic because detained migrants who don't have counsel aren't going to have someone to advocate about why a class action ruling applies to them. So there's a chance judges won't apply the protections, which means justice becomes available only to those who can afford lawyers and navigate a deliberately incomprehensible system designed to produce deportations rather than fair adjudications. Now let's return to Victoria, because her story crystallizes everything that's wrong with American immigration policy in 2025. The randomness of enforcement that could fall on anyone at any time, the complete disregard for legal status when ICE wants to detain someone, the separation of families, the psychological torture of detention, and the utter failure of the stated liberal values this country claims to uphold. Matthews said Bulavina had followed U.S. immigration rules to the letter and had built a life in the U.S., had worked, met someone she loved, and gotten married despite all she had gone through back in Europe, and now is being held in detention as if she is a prisoner. This is what happens when you give law enforcement agencies unlimited discretion and minimal oversight. This is what happens when you fund an immigration enforcement apparatus to the tune of $14 billion a year and tell them their job is to hit deportation quotas. This is what happens when you treat immigration as a law enforcement problem rather than a humanitarian issue requiring compassion and common sense. And we need to be absolutely clear about who benefits from this system, because it's certainly not American workers whose jobs are supposedly being protected. It's certainly not American communities which are made less safe when people are afraid to report crimes or cooperate with police for fear of deportation. It's certainly not the American economy which depends on immigrant labor in agriculture and construction and food service and healthcare. No, the beneficiaries are private prison corporations making billions from detention contracts, politicians who use fear of immigrants to mobilize voters, and the broader project of white supremacy that requires a permanent underclass of exploitable workers who can be threatened with deportation to keep them compliant. This is how capitalism and racism intersect to create systems of oppression that are incredibly effective at extracting value from human suffering while maintaining plausible deniability about their true purpose. What's happening to Victoria right now is a human rights violation. Full stop. And the fact that it's being carried out by agents of the United States government under color of law doesn't make it any less egregious. Every hour she spends in that detention center is an hour of unnecessary suffering inflicted by a state that claims to value freedom and human dignity. Every day Victor goes without knowing when he'll see his wife again is a day of psychological torture, and every moment that ICE continues to hold her, despite having no legal basis to do so, is another data point demonstrating that the entire immigration enforcement system is rotten to its core and must be abolished rather than reformed. Because you cannot reform a system this fundamentally designed to inflict cruelty, you cannot tweak the policies of an agency whose institutional culture celebrates deporting people to war zones and separating families and detaining children. You cannot make humane an apparatus built explicitly to terrorize and exclude and punish people for the crime of seeking safety and opportunity. And here's what should terrify everyone paying attention. The Trump administration will likely continue to ramp up deportations with all available tools and resources, especially as it explores new strategies to rescind protections and expedite removals with minimal due process. And while its goal of 1 million deportations a year may be difficult to achieve, the administration's impact across the immigration system is nonetheless likely to be historic. We are living through a moment of profound moral crisis, a moment when the United States is revealing itself to be exactly what critics have always said it was, an empire built on stolen land through genocide and slavery that has never truly reckoned with its foundational violence and continues to reproduce that violence through institutions like ICE that serve as modern manifestations of the same white supremacist logic that animated chattel slavery and indigenous removal. Victoria Bulavina deserves to be free right now. She deserves to be home with her husband. She deserves to have her green card application processed fairly and approved so she can continue building her life in the country she chose as refuge from war. Instead, she's sitting in a cell at Otay Mesa wondering if she'll be deported back to Ukraine, where Russian missiles continue to rain down on civilian infrastructure, wondering if all her efforts to do everything legally were just a cruel joke, wondering if America's promises of refuge mean anything at all, when ICE agents can show up at your green card interview and disappear you into the detention system. This is not an immigration policy, this is state-sponsored terrorism, and every single person who remains silent in the face of this violence is complicit in its continuation. The time for incremental reform and polite advocacy has long passed. What this moment demands is abolition, reparations, and a fundamental reimagining of how we treat people seeking safety and opportunity in this country, because anything less is simply rearranging deck chairs on a ship that needs to be scuttled and rebuilt from the hull up.